to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello everyone. Today we have Sonya discussing with John on the date of the Gospel book, John. We are continuing from the last episode today. We hope you enjoy.
John 21:18-19, we read that out where Jesus foretells the manner of Peter's death, will be crucifixion. And the skeptics then, and evangelical scholars will say as well, the inference to be drawn from 21:19 is that Peter had by his death glorified God when chapter 21 was composed. Peter died in AD 64 or 65. Dates earlier than that for the composition of the fourth gospel seem unlikely. Now, I ask you, you've read this passage yourself many times. Would you draw that inference?
No, it seems like he's foretelling the future. So, what do you mean he had already glorified God by chapter 21?
Well, exactly. This is why the acceptance of this argument just seems so strange to me. This is a predictive prophecy by Jesus about the death of Peter. It has to be, because whenever the Gospel according to John was written, this statement was still made by Jesus in the year 33. So it's definitely a predictive prophecy. Now, if Jesus could actually foretell the future so that a prophecy recorded in a Gospel book need not have been fulfilled prior to the writing of the book, which evangelicals argue. You remember the liberal argument for late dating the Gospel books to the year 70 and after is that there's predictive prophecy here by Jesus about the destruction of the temple. And they would say, no. The temple had to have been destroyed by the time this was written. Otherwise, Jesus would be doing genuine predictive prophecy, which we reject. But by the same token, Jesus here is doing predictive prophecy about the death of Peter. And the evangelical scholars will say, no, of course, the temple doesn't have to be destroyed by the time of writing because Jesus could foretell the future. Out of the other side of their mouths are saying, no, Peter must have died by this time. That's why it's in there. And that to me just does not make sense.
That's inconsistent.
It is absolutely inconsistent. Now, you'll say that, look, well, Matthew often cited a fulfilled prophecy. It would be uncharacteristic of him not to mention the destruction of the temple if it had already happened by that time. And they want to have a different standard for Matthew than for John. But it doesn't work. It's actually more certain in the case of John. Indeed, Matthew does record a number of fulfillments of prophecies from the Old Testament. John does also. But John also is the only gospel writer who cites a fulfillment of Jesus' own prophecies. In John 18:9 and John 18:32. In both of these passages, there's a prophecy made or referred to that Jesus himself had made, and it's recorded that this is fulfilled because Jesus had foretold it. If we look at John 18, verse 9, we read, verse 8 actually, Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way. This is at his arrest. Verse 9, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. And then later in chapter 18, verse 32, so again, starting verse 31, then Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. So you have two clear passages in the Gospel according to John where Jesus' own prophecies were fulfilled, and mention is made of that. So you would think that if Jesus' prophecy about the death of Peter had already been fulfilled by the time the Gospel according to John was written, it certainly should have been mentioned that this fulfilled what he said. So why these evangelical scholars find an argument of this nature so compelling regarding a late date for the Gospel according to John, though they rejected for a late date of Matthew and Mark, is very difficult for me to understand.
Well, maybe they think that something like telling what kind of manner he would die is more predictable, because people do get crucified in those days.
And yet the fulfillment of the prophecy in 1832 was about the very same issue, though in that case of Jesus' death, not Peter's. And there it was fulfilled. So it just seems to me that this is not an argument, saying not one an evangelical should make. And if you think those are bad, the arguments become just completely off the wall. One evangelical scholar suggests this, trying to justify a late date for the gospel according to John, somewhere in the 90s. He says, during his ministry, Paul, of course, was the principal protagonist against heresy. For example, his letter to the Galatians. So if we take the view that John wrote to combat further heresy, it would be logical for there to have been a time gap of a couple of decades or so after the death of Paul for these heresies to have arisen and to have become somewhat established, that is, to have become worth refuting. Any comment on that?
Why does it take a long time for heresies to arise?
Well, that's a good question. Anything else?
What do you mean to become worth refuting?
That's another good point. There's so much wrong in this statement. Now, John, as we've said, told us. He gave his stated purpose in writing his gospel book, John 20:31. It is an evangelistic tract to introduce non-Christians to Jesus, who he is, what he did, what it means to us, how to be saved. It was not written as a refutation of heresy.
Although if you're telling people the true gospel, isn't that by nature refuting heresy?
Well, it will be a consequence of what you're saying, but it's not your purpose in doing it. The scholar says, if we take the view that John wrote to combat further heresy, the idea is giving is that, look, Paul was refuting heresy. Paul dies, nobody's around to do it. Heresies build up, so John jumps in the breach and writes this book to refute heresy. Is that why he wrote this book?
No.
No, absolutely not. Second, we have to ask this claim that Paul, of course, was the principal protagonist against heresy on the basis that he wrote a letter refuting a certain heresy that was threatening a church he himself had founded. Does he think that the other apostles were not also combating heresy during this time, but left it all to Paul? Do we not see, like in the letters of Peter, for example, and James, things that could be seen as addressing heresy? Third problem, does he really think that Paul managed to stamp out completely all heresies by the time of his death, and nothing else needed to be done for, quote, a couple of decades or so after the death of Paul? Does that sound at all reasonable to you? No, it doesn't. And again, just crazier and crazier arguments. This one from Brooke Foss Westcott of the infamous Westcott and Hort Greek New Testament. He writes this, quote, "No one can read the fourth gospel carefully without feeling that the writer occupies a position remote from the events which he describes."
Wait a minute, didn't you just quote a verse about how he leaned on his breast, the one whom Jesus loved, and he's right there?
Yes.
So how's he remote?
Well, that's Westcott says so. No, I don't. No one can read the fourth gospel carefully without feeling that the writer occupies a position remote from the events which he describes. However clear it is that he was an eyewitness of the life of the Lord, it is no less clear that he looks back upon it from a distance. Okay? So in other words, it must have been written late because we feel it's late. Okay? Now, you've read the Gospel according to John a number of times, haven't you?
Yeah.
And so have I. Did you ever, and you read it carefully, right?
I hope so.
Yeah, I would think so. Did you actually, as you were reading it, did you get the feeling that the writer was looking back upon the events from a distance?
No, and especially not after being reminded of that verse you just quoted.
He tries to back this up. He says, one plain proof of this is found in the manner in which he records words which point to the spread of the gospel beyond the limits of Judaism. In other words, it went out to the Gentiles.
How does that mean he was remote?
Well, he would say it takes a bit of time to get out to the Gentiles, but okay, it does. But let's look, for example, at Paul's letters. We know through in the book of Acts how the gospel got to the Gentiles. Paul was the apostle tasked with bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. He didn't exactly do that wholeheartedly. He tended to go to the Jews first, but he did bring the gospel to the Gentiles, established many churches in the Gentile world, and he's not the one who did all of that either. In the epistle to the Romans that Paul wrote, it's clear that there's a very large, prosperous church with a lot of Gentiles in it in the city of Rome. And he's writing around the year 57. So certainly by 57 and earlier, the gospel spread far beyond the limits of Judaism. So if it's done that by the year 57, how can you say that spreading beyond the limits of Judaism puts you into 95?
You can't.
You can't. Okay? It just makes no sense. So these are the arguments for late dating of the Gospel according to John that just do not work.
Are there any more plausible arguments?
There's one, okay? There's one that could be considered good, and this really, I think, trumps all the rest of them. This is the one that most evangelicals will go with. And it's like this. There seems to be a common belief that this late dating is strongly supported by the early Christian writers. One scholar puts it this way: the church fathers are most persuasive evidence for the date of John, and they unanimously ascribe a later date to John, written when he was a very old man. Does that sound like a viable argument?
Well, how old was he when the events took place?
Well, he must have been pretty young when they took place if he lived into the 90s. But prima facie, this would be a good argument, and we do have to take the testimony of the early church fathers seriously, which we have been doing. These are people in contact with sources of information long since lost to us. Some of the church fathers were students of the apostles themselves, or students of men who had been trained by the apostles. So their testimony definitely has to carry a lot of weight. So this would be a really good argument for late dating of the Gospel according to John, if it were actually true. But it isn't. It isn't true. There is testimony, pretty good amount of testimony that John lived to an old age, but not that he wrote his gospel book at an old age. They seem to be conflating the two. The testimony that he wrote it at an old age is so weak, it can be discounted absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.